Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining this Leadership Institute special presentation on Silence is Not an Option, presented by Liberty Counsel and Matt Staver. Just a little bit of housekeeping in the beginning. The Leadership Institute, of course, is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit. Our mission is to increase the number and effectiveness of conservative activists in public policy and politics, and we do that by doing trainings, activist trainings. You can go to our website at leadershipinstitute.org to see the many different trainings that we offer. We offer about 47 different types or schools worth of trainings. And every day here at the Leadership Institute, especially while we're all working from home, we do them all online. So you can look at those and take them with us. We were founded in 1979 by Morton Blackwell. We've been around for 40 years, and in that time, we've trained over 225,000 conservative activists to be active in public policy and politics. So it brings me great joy to bring this particular presentation to you. It is for pastors and church leaders, but also Christians and people of faith who want to be involved in politics. And we're going to be talking about why they should be involved in politics. And this is a presentation by Matt Staver. Matt is the co-founder and senior pastor and chairman of Liberty Counsel. He is the chairman of Liberty Counsel Action, Faith and Liberty. He's also on the National Pro-Life Center, the Freedom Federation, Salt and Light Council, and National House of Hope. And he's the founder and chairman of Liberty Relief International. He's the vice president and chief counsel for the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, which includes over 42,000 evangelical Hispanic churches. And he's the former vice president of Liberty University and a former dean and tenured professor at the School of Law at Liberty University. He's a trustee of the Timothy Plan, a New York and Tel Aviv Stock Exchange traded family of mutual funds. He's a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and he's a member of the Board of Reference of the Christian Film and Television Commission, and a member of the board of the Advisors for Care for Pastors, and the founder and former president of Staver & Associates, and the founder and former president of the Staver Group. Matt is also the host and producer of Faith and Freedom podcast and radio program and Freedom's Call radio program. He produces a Bible study podcast. He's a frequent guest on many international and national network and television, cable television, and radio show programs. And he's been interviewed by thousands of print and electronic media sources. Mr. Staver, that was a lot to say. Thank you so
That's
very
why
much.
I told you, Dina, you didn't need to go through all of that. So thank you.
I know, that's okay. I thank you so very much for leading us. I know that you do very important work as far as fighting for religious liberty. And so that's what brings me the excitement here and getting our churches involved. When I was promoting this presentation, I told the story of back in 2006 when I was working on a campaign in South Dakota. It was an issue campaign that would have outlawed all abortions in South Dakota. And on a Sunday morning, I was sitting in church and I was all excited because the bishop had told the pastors, the Catholic pastors, they had to speak on this issue. And I was all excited for the homily because my issue is going to be mentioned from the pulpit like the first time in my political career.
Yeah.
And instead, my priest gave a sermon about the upcoming Advent because we were only 40 days out, and then passed out little gifts to all the kids to remember God's love and God's gift of Jesus, which was coming 40 days after the 40 days that we were beginning, 80 days away. I have never been so upset at a priest for not taking a political stand in my entire life.
Yeah.
Please educate me. What should I have said to the priest to let him know that it was okay, even though his bishop had already said so, to let him know it was okay to take a political stand in that case?
Well, thank you, Dina, and thank you, the Leadership Institute. It's such a great organization, and Liberty Counsel. We are very pleased to partner with you in addressing this. One of the titles for this could be Silence is Not an Option. In fact, I have a DVD that is here, and it's actually by that name, Silence is Not an Option, and so we can make these available for you. It's actually a presentation of what I've done, and we also have a little Patriots Handbook that says Patriots Handbook on Political Action for Pastors and Churches. And so, Dina, there's a number of things that I would say to your priest and to pastors and to church leaders, lay people all over this country, and also to nonprofit organizations and leaders. We're going to be really focusing on all of those, but I think it's very important. Number one, I want to talk about why you should speak out, and number two, how you can speak out in terms of what you're able to do. And so that's really what I want to go through on this presentation. Before I get into the issues of what you can do, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about what you can do. There's more fear about what you can't do. I want to tell you about what you can do, because you can do a whole lot more than you are prohibited from doing. And that's one of the myths out there. But there's two reasons sometimes why people don't speak out, particularly pastors or in the church. One is because of what we're going to be talking about today, and that is they somehow fear, or they may use it as an excuse, or they may have heard that you would lose your tax-exempt status as a church or a nonprofit organization if you addressed political issues. When I'm talking about political issues, I'm talking about two different categories. We'll break them down here in a few moments. And that is candidates running for elected office and legislation at the local, state, and federal level, different kinds of laws. Those will be the two different categories. And sometimes they think that by speaking out on these issues, you're going to lose your tax-exempt status. We're going to address that misinformation. But on the other hand, there are some that use that, even though they may know the truth, as an excuse as to why they're not going to speak out. And that's a whole different issue. You know, right now we are at a very critical moment in history. I was a pastor, still am a pastor, before I went into law school, and we litigate all over the country. We're representing a lot of people around the nation, including, you know, very high-profile pro-life cases, Sandra Merritt, who did the undercover video regarding Planned Parenthood. And we're litigating in a number of states. We're working with several thousand pastors, but we're litigating in a number of states with regards to churches in reference to these different orders that try to micromanage what you can and can't do. Like, for example, California, which says you can't sing or chant, or in other 80% of the population, you can't even have any service at all, in-person service, and that includes home Bible studies and fellowship. So we're litigating in that state right now. But I didn't, when I felt a call to a pastor, I didn't go to my mailbox hoping to get a receipt or a letter from the IRS giving me a call to be a pastor. That came directly from God. If we ever come to a point in time, and this is for our friends that are not necessarily in the United States, but our friend that joined us from Canada. If we ever come to a point in time where the government says that you cannot speak on something related to the Bible, well, we know what the scriptures say in Acts chapter 5. We have to obey God rather than man, that we have to follow our God-given call. The government didn't give us our call. The government can't take it away, and the government can't micromanage what we can or cannot say with respect to the Bible. So let me just begin to go through this issue of what you can do, because right now we're in probably the most critical time in America with respect to the upcoming elections at all different levels of our office, from the president down to local positions, and certainly in our United States Congress. The most critical time I've ever seen. We have seen so many riots and even all the different kinds of protests that we've seen. We've seen an attempt to destroy America in so many different ways. And there are certainly lots of attempts to undermine our Judeo-Christian values. So much is riding on not only these upcoming elections, but all elections, but particularly the one that we're going to be facing in America this coming November. So let me go through the basic background of what you can and cannot do. And I think this is very important. There's a distinction between nonprofits. When I'll say nonprofits, I'm going to be referring to 501c3 organizations. 501c3 organizations. These are nonprofits that contributions to those organizations are tax deductible. And we're also going to be talking about churches. Churches, whether you have an IRS letter or not, you're considered a 501c3 organization. Contributions to you are tax deductible. So that's the kind of organization we're going to be talking about. Any nonprofit organization that seeks tax exemption so that they are tax exempt and contributions are tax deductible, any nonprofit that's not a church needs to first apply to the IRS for that exemption. And after a period of time, if they are approved, the IRS will give you an exemption letter acknowledging that you are approved and contributions to you are tax deductible. Churches, however, are uniquely different in the IRS code, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Churches, although they're considered nonprofit, unlike nonprofits, they do not need an IRS exemption letter to be considered tax exempt. They can obtain one voluntarily, and it may be nice for convenience if somebody asks for your tax exemption letter. But unlike a general nonprofit, not a church, you don't need to have an IRS exemption letter to be exempt from income taxes and contributions to which are tax deductible. In other words, from the very first moment that a church meets, if we were going to start a church today and begin it even in a house church or a storefront church, a very small group that can grow later on, from that very moment of conception, if you will, that church is tax exempt and contributions to it are tax deductible. It's a critical difference between churches in specific versus nonprofits in general. And we'll come back to that in just a few moments. So let's look at two different categories of IRS restrictions with regards to nonprofits. And again, I'm looking at 501c3 organizations, which also include churches. There's the lobbying restriction that came into the IRS code in 1934. And then there's the political intervention provision that came into the IRS code in 1954. And in that particular situation, let me just say that no church has ever lost its tax-exempt status for engaging in lobbying or for engaging in political intervention. Now, let me break these down. First of all, let's focus on the lobbying provision. This came into the IRS code in 1934, involving 501c3 organizations, which also include churches with or without a letter from the IRS. You're still considered a 501c3 for tax purposes, no matter whether you applied or you didn't. So these are the categories that I'm talking about. There are specific organizations like a 501c4 organization that you can create. For example, Liberty Counsel has Liberty Counsel Action, which is our 501c4, and we can lobby all day long without any issue. But that particular nonprofit, while it's tax exempt, doesn't have to pay taxes, contributions to it are not tax deductible like they are for Liberty Counsel. So this lobbying restriction came in the code in 1934. The definition of lobbying is supporting or opposing local, state, or national laws. Whether you're supporting or opposing an ordinance, a policy at the school board, at your city council, at your county commission, or at your state level, or at your federal level, either being in favor of or in opposition to a local, state, or federal law. It includes voter initiatives and also political nominations or appointments. Let me just talk about that for a minute. When you have a voter initiative where the voters go to the ballot to vote on, say, for example, a state or local amendment to the charter or to the state constitution, that would come under lobbying. Or if you have a political nominee or an appointment, say, for example, the president nominates a justice for the United States Supreme Court or any other appointed position at the federal, local, or state level. That would be a political nomination or a political appointment. Although these are individuals, not laws, they come under the lobbying provision, not the political intervention provision of the IRS code. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we come back to it. It says that you may not devote more and this is from the IRS code, a substantial part of the organization's overall activity to lobbying. It doesn't describe what a substantial part is. It just says that these 501c3 organizations, which include churches, you may lobby, but you cannot devote more than a substantial part of your overall activity to lobbying. Now, let's break down what that ultimately means. There's generally a guideline. It's not in the IRS code, but it's in the various IRS cases or rules, and it's called essentially the 5 to 15% rule. And 5% of your overall activity is clearly permissible, all the way up to 15% of your overall activity is clearly permissible without even affecting your tax exemption. Now, let's break that down, and you'll see why no church has ever lost its tax exempt status. Let's look at this particular rule. Now, we're going to apply the 5% minimum. So in other words, think of your church or your nonprofit 501c3 as a pie being 100%. We're going to apply the very minimum. We know for a fact that 5% is clearly permissible. And somewhere as you get closer to 15%, that gets closer to the line where some of your taxation will be at issue. You won't lose your tax exempt status, but you might have a penalty. So let's look at the 5%. We know that if you can pass the 5% rule, you can pass anything. So this illustration is looking at what I call a do-nothing church. A do-nothing church, you know, I've pastored churches. I know there are people here that may attend do-nothing churches or have pastored do-nothing churches. Hopefully you're not currently pastoring or in a do-nothing church, but this church really is a do-nothing church. It's unlike anything you've ever seen before. This particular church has no paid staff. No paid staff at all. The pastor's not paid. Everyone volunteers. But they don't do anything outside of what I'm showing you on the screen. This particular church has a 3-hour service on Sunday from 9 to 12, 3 hours. And it has an additional 1.5-hour meeting in the midweek, say from 7 to 8:30. The total activity in 1 week, 7 days of this church is only 4.5 hours. Now, when I'm talking about 4.5 hours, I'm talking about only 4.5 hours. I'm talking about the pastor shows up at 9 and he never prepares for the message. He just comes there, and the people that do Sunday school, they don't prepare for the Sunday school lesson. The choir doesn't practice. They just show up, and literally all they do is 4.5 hours a week. They leave at 12. They don't think about anything anymore, and they don't do anything to practice or to study in preparation for the next week, and the same for the midweek. So this church, again, it's hard to conceptualize a church like this, but I'm using this as an example, is really a do-nothing church. It really doesn't do anything. It does only 4.5 hours, no paid staff, no volunteer activity, no preparation before or after these 4.5 hours. Now, 5% of 4.5 hours is 13.5 minutes. That means this do-nothing church on Sunday, between its 9 to 12 service, for example, and if it involves, say, a 30-minute sermon, that church can devote 13.5 minutes every single Sunday specifically to lobbying. In other words, almost half of a 30-minute sermon can be devoted 52 Sundays a week, every week, regarding lobbying. And that could be encouraging people to oppose or support any local, state, or federal law, or some appointee. Now, I know it would almost be impossible to do that, but this is what I'm trying to illustrate. A 5% of a do-nothing 4.5-hour church can still devote 13.5 minutes every week toward lobbying. Now, if that particular church 1 week doesn't have anything to talk about with respect to lobbying, then it's 13 and a half minutes times 2, because we're looking at a substantial part of your overall activity, not the activity on that particular week alone, but your activity looking at it almost for a period of a year. So let's just say this church doesn't do anything on week number 2. So week number 3, it can do 13 and a half minutes times 2. That means this church can do essentially the entire sermon. Now let's skip 2 weeks. There's nothing to talk about for, say, 2 weeks, and they don't have to be consecutive weeks. They could be during a 52-week period. That means that that church can now, when it comes back to the issue of lobbying, can devote 13 and a half minutes times 3 and so forth. You kind of get the idea. So this do-nothing church can really do a lot when it comes to lobbying. Let's continue to look at this now. Let's add a little bit of meat to the bones, but not too much. Let's have a pastor, and this pastor is now paid 40 hours a week. No other volunteer service, but he's paid 40 hours a week. Now, this pastor also has an assistant part-time, and this assistant is paid 20 hours per week. So you have 5 members that actually do some volunteering. And each one of those 5 members, they volunteer 1 hour a week. And it could be volunteering to prepare for special music, for choir practice, or to do Sunday school lessons, for example, or midweek lessons. But they're doing a 1 hour a week volunteerism. You look at this and let's add them together. The pastor's time is 40 hours. The assistants is 20. The 5 volunteers, and they don't have to be paid, are 5 hours. And you add all of those together, 4.5 weeks, plus the 4.5 hours of time together. So you have 40, 20, 5, and then the 4.5 hours of actual meeting together. That computes every week to 69 and 1/2 hours. Now, what's 5% of that? 5% means that that church every week could devote 3.5 hours per week, which is 5% of 69.5, to lobbying. Now, if that church decides that it does not want to go and do lobbying, let me back down to this one. If it does not want to do lobbying 1 week, then again, it's the same situation. It's going to be 13 and a half minutes times 2, like it was in the first one. Or in this particular case, it's going to be the 3.5 hours times 2. So in other words, the first week of January, this kind of church that just has 69.5 hours of total activity, paid and unpaid activity, can devote 3.5 hours. That means 9 to 12 plus another 30 minutes on midweek can be devoted to this kind of activity of lobbying. And if you skip a week, it's going to be 3.5 hours times 2 and so forth. And that's why when you really start to analyze this, no church has ever come close to this. A church or a nonprofit organization could literally almost be turned into a political machine in terms of a church, for example, on its Sunday services. I know you're not going to want to do that. You've got other biblical things you're going to address, and there's not always going to be something with regards to a local, state, or federal issue that you need to address. The point is that you can, and that's why no church has ever come even close to violating the lobbying provision. Now let's look at the 1954 provision. This is the big one because this is the one that people generally refer to about tax-exempt status. The definition here is that you may not support or oppose a candidate, and I want to underscore the word candidate, for elected office. You may not oppose or support a candidate for an elected office. Unlike, for example, the lobbying, where you can involve the organization, but not more than a substantial part, here it says you cannot support or oppose a candidate for elective office. Now, this is an absolute prohibition. It does not include the nominees or the political appointments because, as I said, they fall under the lobbying provision, not the political intervention provision. Let me move on for just a few moments. Let's look at a particular church that actually is the only one that really addressed this issue in the years since 1954. And it's called the Church at Pierce Creek. It's a case going back to 1992. It's in Binghamton, New York. And this particular church then opposed Governor Bill Clinton for President of the United States. And as he was running, this church took out full-page ads in the USA Today newspaper and the Washington Times. They spent thousands and thousands of dollars to take out those full-page ads. And they opposed then Governor Bill Clinton for President of the United States because of his pro-abortion position. In that ad, they urged people to vote against Governor, later President Clinton. They had the church's name in the ad, the address of the church in the ad, and they encouraged people to give donations to the church with their address listed so that they could continue to run additional ads. So they clearly ultimately crossed the line. They opposed a candidate for elected office, and they put the church's name front and center, and they expended financial resources to that particular ad, and they asked for additional resources so that they could do more ads to run against Governor Bill Clinton. Well, as you know, Bill Clinton did win the nomination and the vote in 1992, and after he became president, the IRS came to the church under Bill Clinton's leadership. And they ultimately said to the church that you violated the law. The church clearly was wanting to take on the IRS directly. They wanted to resolve this in court, and they weren't going to back down. They could have easily resolved this without litigation, but they chose to litigate because what happened was this particular church chose to actually get a tax-exempt letter. Again, churches can have that, but they don't need it. Some churches in the United States have a tax-exempt letter. Many churches do not have tax-exempt letters. It doesn't really matter. You're both tax-exempt if you're operating and acting like a church, as a normal church body, gathering together. You have a set of doctrines. You come together and you have a creed. You have some kind of process for selecting leadership or anything of that nature, just general indicia of what a church is. You're automatically tax exempt without a letter. This church chose to ultimately get one of these letters. So the IRS revoked the letter from this church. The church ultimately sued. It went to the District Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia, and the Court of Appeals ultimately ruled that IRS can take the letter, but particularly it said the letter as it relates to churches is really symbolic and has really no substantive purpose. It doesn't have any substantive impact on whether you have a letter or whether you don't have a letter. And so the IRS could take the letter because the church clearly did cross the line. However, during the oral argument, the IRS actually admitted that not one contribution to the church would be taxable. Not one contribution that was given by any particular individual would be taxable, and the church never lost its tax-exempt letter, or it never lost its tax exemption, I should say, even though it lost its letter. So that's the big difference between nonprofits, which are not churches, and churches. Both are treated as 501c3s. Both are nonprofit and tax exempt, tax exemption also for the people who give for these deductions on their IRS forms. Both of them are in the same category. Nonprofits, not a church, need a letter. Churches don't need a letter, but you can get a letter. Therefore, the letter doesn't really mean anything, because from the very moment that a church, as I mentioned, comes into existence, that church is automatically tax exempt. So let's kind of walk this through. Say, for example, this church clearly crossed the line on the day that those ads were published. By the time the IRS actually came to the church, or just even assuming the very next day, the church doesn't run an ad the next day. The church has every day a brand new day. It's almost as though every day is separate from the day before, because every day you're born again, if you will. That is a new day, as though you were starting that church that day. What you did yesterday or last week does not carry over to what you're doing today. Now, in the worst case scenario, in the very worst case scenario, although this church never had to deal with this, in the very worst case scenario, the IRS, I've never seen them simply just revoke tax exemption of even nonprofit organizations without some kind of negotiation. And what usually happens in something like that, if you have a 501c3 nonprofit tax exempt organization, not a church, if you do lose your letter, then your tax exemption does go with that letter. You have to apply for that letter again, and you'll have to wait until you ultimately get the letter in order to be tax exempt. But before any of that ever came to that point, typically what the IRS does is they do an inquiry, and I'm talking about non-churches, but are nonprofit. They do an inquiry about learning the facts. They also do an inquiry as to what your plans are for the future. Are you going to continue to do that same thing? Well, in the case of this particular church, even though it's a church, there was no election after Bill Clinton got elected, so it was an easy situation for them, but they wanted to take this battle on. But in a nonprofit situation, if a nonprofit clearly crosses the line, before the IRS ever would affect the tax-exempt status of that church or that nonprofit, they would likely negotiate to ultimately address the issue of a penalty. Say, for example, if you expended $100,000 toward these ads, say if it was a nonprofit that was not a church, and you expended $100,000 for these ads, the worst case scenario would be a small penalty of that $100,000 expenditure, rather than complete loss of tax exemption. A 20% penalty of either a fine or alternatively that portion would not be considered tax deductible. So that's generally the process. The nonprofits, unless you literally turn a 501c3 nonprofit into a constant political machine, you don't have anything to worry about. Churches clearly don't have anything to worry about, because even this church that indeed crossed the line never lost its tax exempt status, and the contributions to it were never taxable to the church or to the people who were making the contributions. Now, let me, before we talk about permissible activity, this particular church is the only case that we have. And so when someone says that your church is going to lose your tax exempt status, this is the only church case out there since 1954 that involves anything like this. Clearly crossed the line, but clearly never lost its tax exempt status. Now, I know groups will send letters to pastors and churches, particularly on the eve of election, and they will threaten by saying that if you address any political issue or candidate issue, then you will lose your tax exempt status. That is a myth, and it is frankly not true. Let me also say, before I go into permissible activity, this is the landscape of the law even before President Trump took office at the White House. Now, after he became president, he also issued an executive order to the various agencies, including the Internal Revenue Service, and he essentially told them to stand down on this issue. Because in 1954, the issue regarding political intervention, the prohibition against endorsing or supporting candidates for office. That actually came in because of then Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, later President LBJ. When he was running for United States Senate, there was a nonprofit, not a church, that opposed his candidacy. When he became a senator, in order to get back at them, he proposed this amendment that became what's called the Johnson Amendment in 1954. It was added to the IRS code without any debate or any discussion. That's how it got there. It was a vendetta against nonprofits, not churches, that ultimately opposed his election as Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson. And so that's how it got in the IRS code since 1954. It's called the Johnson Amendment. Now, President Trump issued an executive order directing the IRS to stand down and not pursue any issues involving the so-called Johnson Amendment, particularly with regards to pastors speaking from the pulpit or in different kinds of official church venues. That IRS was not to investigate or to enforce the Johnson Amendment. Now, if that ultimately changes and there's a different president and that executive order is ultimately removed and we're back to the way we were before President Trump issued the executive order, what I just told you is the actual law. And so we have a double guarantee of the fact that churches should have no concern. One, the current issue involving President Trump's executive order to the IRS to stand down on enforcement regarding churches. And two, even if that weren't there, this is how the law has been since 1954 and going back to 1934 with regards to the lobbying provision. So here's something within that construct, within the existing law, without, for example, this extra layer of protection with President Trump's executive order. What you can do clearly that is permissible. What we know is that the church at Pierce Creek clearly crossed the line. But even doing that, that particular church didn't lose its tax-exempt status. But here's what you clearly can do with regards to political intervention, opposing or supporting a candidate for local, state, or federal law. First of all, you can preach on any topic. Just because politicians are debating it or there's an issue going on within the elected world of politicians doesn't mean that that issue is now political. In fact, there's no issue, in my view, that is political. All of these issues are biblical. The Bible speaks to all of these issues, whether it's the sanctity of human life, marriage, fatherlessness, the importance of the nuclear family, poverty, racism, whatever it is, the Bible addresses those issues. So there's no topic that's ever off limits. And I encourage you as pastors and church leaders and those that are in connection with pastors and church leaders to urge your pastors and church leaders to literally speak on these issues. People are hungry for these issues. Some polls have indicated that a vast majority of pastors believe that the Bible addresses all of these issues. But many have said they don't want to address these issues, that they stay away from them. On the other hand, when you look at individuals polling, they want the pastors in their churches to address these issues. Now, I deal a lot with young people, college-age young people, through a ministry called Covenant Journey, and we take them on a life-changing experience to Israel. These are top-performing college young people from now about 300 different colleges and universities. These are your top performers in every conceivable area of career and education, and they're all over America, and they're now all over the world. One of the things that I find when we are with them, and we are sort of like on a 10-day boot camp spiritual journey in Israel with deep biblical teaching and praise and worship and fellowship. And they long for that. And one of the things that I often hear is that they're not getting that at home. These young people and every other person in your church long for that biblical teaching so that they can understand how they must live, how they should order and guide and direct their lives. The issues that we see in the world around us We need to address those issues every day, and we need to address those and educate people on a regular basis from the pulpit in these particular churches all over the country. People are wanting it, people are needing it. And when you do that on a regular basis and don't shy from any issues that are going on in our culture or that the Bible addresses, then you're not going to have to tell people who to vote for. You're going to have to just inform them about where the candidates stand in these particular issues and encourage them to vote biblical values. So clearly you can preach on any topic. You can educate through your sermons and other communication vehicles, through different meetings. You can explain the positions of candidates when it comes time to do that, and we're approaching that time during every election. Explain the issue of candidates. Where do they stand? For example, you can preach on the sanctity of human life, how God knitted us intimately from the moment of conception, how he called Jeremiah and gave him a calling while he was still in his mother's womb. There's lots of different scripture verses, Psalm 139 and so many others, about how God created life, how he created you and I in his image as the crowning act of creation. And we can then begin to extrapolate that from a biblical standpoint. We can then include the fact with regards to the taking of innocent human life through abortion. Now, how I became a pastor, how I became an attorney was when I was a pastor. When I was a pastor, I was out of seminary, pastoring a church, and it was my first year as pastoring, full-time with my own churches. I knew the biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac. I studied biblical history and archaeology and other things. I was very well versed coming out of seminary. I still read those languages. And I was invited by some pastors to watch a video. At the time, it was called Assignment Life, brand new documentary about abortion. And there was a Roman Catholic and there was a Protestant in Kentucky that wanted to reach the pastors. And we were the very first small group of pastors that they reached out to show this brand new documentary, Assignment Life. So a pastor friend of mine invited me to come, and there was about a dozen of us, and we watched this video called Assignment Life. And I was literally stunned. I knew all this about the scriptures. I knew all the languages. I preached every week and midweek. I did all the things that pastors do. And yet I didn't know about this incredible evil issue that was in my backyard. I only knew about what I had read in the media, and I didn't realize what we were dealing with as a human life. We didn't have the ultrasound back then, but what we did have in this documentary, we had the fetal models, and then we had the very famous 1965 Life magazine photographs. These were revolutionary. And this was well before the 1973 Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision. This was 1965. Life magazine was one of those few magazines widely distributed, and the very front cover was a baby in the womb, still in the amniotic sac. And it was in Life, but it was an article series about the miracle of life. And in that feature story, they had page after page of the development from the moment of conception up until the late second to early third trimester in the womb. Some of these particular photographs were in vitro flash photography, very revolutionary kind of photography at the time. And these were phenomenal photographs. And that's what I saw, but I also saw an actual first semester abortion. And in that documentary, of course, once the abortion was done, the abortionist had to reassemble the body parts of the baby on that slab. And they put the baby parts together to make sure they got all of the baby parts through the first trimester cannula tube, suction tube abortion process. And it was very clear what we're dealing with as a human being in the very early stages. It was a small human being, looks just like you and me. It had fingers and toes, and it had all the body parts. You could see the ribs, the eyes, the skull. It was just mutilated, but it was all there. And when I saw that, I was stunned. I ended up going to a local Right to Life organization, reading everything that they had, and then go to the University of Kentucky Law Library, where I read Roe versus Wade, the very first legal case I ever read. And frankly, as a non-lawyer, it did not make sense what they had done. It was that issue that ultimately compelled me into realizing that my faith has to impact the community. As I have been transformed by Christ, I have a duty to impact and transform the world around me. And I cannot remain silent when these children are brutally murdered every single day. And that ultimately led my career from the pastoral pulpit ministry into law and eventually the founding of Liberty Counsel. What we need to do is preach on these subject matters. And I know that we have people in our churches that have had abortions, but you can preach about what God says about life, about what abortion really is. And you can also hold out the loving hand of forgiveness. Jesus is in the business of putting broken people back together. And that is an opportunity to heal broken people. Some people are still struggling with these decisions that they did, and the pain still impacts them throughout their life. Now is a time, an opportunity for that pain to be healed, for the chains to be broken. And then you can move into, here's where these candidates running for President of the United States stand on this particular issue, or senator, or for the U.S. Congress, or for your state office, or for your local office. Here's where they stand on this issue of abortion. Here's where they are. And you can also give them objective voter guides. You can put this on a PowerPoint in terms of where they stand. You can give out objective voter guides that compares just different people back and forth in terms of the different candidates. So you can have all these different issues listed. And we have Liberty Counsel works with a lot of different organizations around the country that frequently ask us to review their voter guides to make sure that they're 501c3 compliant. We do. Oftentimes they'll put Liberty Counsel approved on there or reviewed. We'll put those up on our website at lc.org as well. That's a great way for you to be able to distribute information about where these people stand. They need to know two things. One, what does the Bible say? And two, what do the candidates believe? But here's the third thing that you need to incorporate in your teaching and in your messages. Voting, and let me be very clear, voting is not a political act. It is not a political act. It is a prophetic witness to the community. It is projecting and doing on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, what you believe on Sunday. If you believe in the Bible, that God is the author of life, that the taking of innocent life is wrong, then you cannot appoint an agent to act on your behalf to do exactly opposite of what God says in his scriptures. So voting is the appointment of an agent. When you appoint an agent to act on your behalf, that agent is acting for you in a place at a time where you cannot be. And if you don't vote, then you are allowing somebody else to appoint an agent for you. Either way, you will have an agent, whether you vote or don't vote. And the question is, will you sit back and either appoint an agent who is absolutely contrary to the Word of God, who will ultimately push laws that support the slaughter of innocent human beings, or will you have an agent that believes, consistent with your Judeo-Christian values, that abortion is wrong because God created human life and he is the author of life, and we cannot kill these innocent children, that Jesus loves little children? We have a choice, and that choice is to follow the scriptures or not, to vote biblically or not. Now, if you don't vote, you're allowing another person to appoint that agent for you. Either way, we are responsible for the agents that are acting on our behalf. We are responsible. If we allow someone else to put an agent in our place, it's like playing Russian roulette. I don't want to play Russian roulette with something so critically important as helping an innocent human being survive a brutal death, especially when God speaks to that issue. And certainly I am not going to appoint an agent that actually does something completely contrary to God's will. So voting is not a political act, it's a prophetic witness. And voting or non-voting, we're talking about appointment of an agent to act on your behalf. And that's why it's so important to register to vote and to vote biblical values. Now, you need to know what the biblical values are. That's where you come in as a pastor and church leaders, to educate people about what those values are. What does the Bible say? And then secondly, the fact is, what do the candidates believe on these important issues? And then finally, your duty to vote. Now, if you don't want to have a duty to vote, you don't want to be put in a position of not voting or voting and having this burden on you, if you will, then you're in the wrong country. And even for those in Canada, whether your country is free or not, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, we have an obligation as Christians to speak up and to have our values reflect very consistently with our beliefs and the scripture. So again, moving on, you can educate, you can explain the positions of candidates, you can pass out objective voter guides. We'll have some of those available on our website, lc.org, as they become available. You can have candidates come and speak at your church. Candidates may be acknowledged. So for example, you can invite a candidate to speak at the church, and they can give their testimony. They can talk about different values. They can't necessarily use that as a place for a political platform. However, with President Trump's current executive order, and frankly, according to the history of the law even before that, that would be very minimal in terms of any issue that you would encounter. So I wouldn't even be, frankly, that concerned about that. But you can clearly invite candidates to come. You can acknowledge candidates. Here is John Doe, and here's Mary. They're running for, and you can give whatever office they're running for. Thank you for coming. Invite them, others to come, candidates to be acknowledged in your church. Now, you don't have to acknowledge a candidate if you don't want to, but you certainly can. You can also have a candidate forum or a debate where you invite all the candidates to come to your church. Now, it doesn't matter whether candidates that don't agree with you don't show up. You can invite them. And frankly, I think it's great to have people of both sides, because truth is always going to win. I'm not afraid of having truth against some kind of false position, false ideology. So you can invite them. You can actually conduct a candidate forum. You can also do voter registration. You have to look at the different states in terms of how to do voter registration. In some places, well, in almost every place, you can work with your local voter registrar, where they can actually come to your church in your lobby and people can register to vote. You can also do some things where people could fill out a form to register to vote. In other words, they would have to fill out a form, and then they would get something in the mail, where they would then have to have a second step where they go through the registration process. I know one pastor, a very famous pastor, he used to have everybody stand up that was registered to vote in his church. And for those that were not registered to vote, he would have the deacons in his church go and pass out to those that were sitting down voter registration forms. So there's lots of different ways to do that. But obviously, you can preach all you want about biblical values, but if people are not registered to vote, they can't vote. And if they don't vote, then they're allowing somebody else, and we're complicit in that if we just simply allow that without some address to it. They're allowing somebody else to appoint a candidate in their position. And that is too much riding on the line to allow Russian roulette when it comes to the sanctity of human life and many of these other issues. You can not only have a voter registration or encourage voter registration, you can encourage people to register to vote. You can help them to register to vote, as I've already talked about. You can also provide even transportation to the polling place for people who don't have that kind of transportation. You can also lend your name and title. So for example, if it were Pastor Matt Staver, for example, of Liberty Council or whatever it might be, your name your title, and the affiliation, the church that you're with. You can lend your name, title, and affiliation for or against a candidate. Now, here's how you do it. And this is from the IRS. You put an asterisk after your name or after your title or after your church, whatever it is, and you just simply say title and affiliation for identification purposes. So in other words, if the candidate wants to put on the website the different people that have endorsed that candidate, your name, your title, and your church, as an example, or nonprofit organization, could actually be listed as somebody who is endorsing that particular candidate. The IRS says it's not an endorsement of the church or the organization if you put this asterisk that says title and affiliation for identification purposes. And so what typically will happen is if you have a number of pastors or several pastors on a website or in a brochure or in a advertisement, you can put an asterisk by each one of their names. At the bottom of that, you say one time, asterisk, title, and affiliation for identification purposes. And that is a personal endorsement rather than a corporate endorsement. Obviously, you can, as an individual, directly support with your name or individual efforts and contributions as an individual. Again, let's go back. I want to encourage you not to have any fear. And we're going to have some time here in a few moments for some Q&A with your questions that you can write in, and Dina will ultimately read those, and we'll be able to have some dialogue on those questions. But no church has ever lost its tax-exempt status. No church has ever lost its tax-exempt status for either lobbying that has been in the IRS code since 1934, being in favor of or in opposition to a local, state, or federal law. And by the way, on this issue, if the particular law in question directly relates to that organization, whether it's a church or a nonprofit organization, not a church, if it directly relates to the existence or something related to that organization, you can lobby all you want to without even the 5 to 15% rule. So in other words, if there was an attempt to repeal tax exemption, if there's an attempt to repeal property tax exemption or zoning laws or anything of that nature that directly relates to the existence of that organization, then those 5 to 15% rule, even though they're very liberal in terms of being very difficult to cross that line and actually create a problem, those don't even apply, because you can lobby all day long when it relates to your specific existence that directly affects your organization. Political intervention, endorsing or being opposite and opposed to any candidate for local, state, or federal office. No church has ever lost its tax-exempt status for that particular matter of political intervention. So I want to encourage all of you to replace the muzzle that the world and secularists want to place on you with a megaphone instead, and don't have any fear whatsoever. And I think that now it is more important, more critical than ever before to address these various issues. This is our Liberty Counsel page and our phone number. You can always contact us at lc.org, which is the easiest way. We have all of our contact people information there. But you can also call us at 407-875-1776, right there, 407-875-1776, or lc.org, lc.org. And with that, that is an overview. And by the way, let me just, again, if you need, or if any of you are doing different events to educate pastors, we can provide these to you at no cost other than shipping. And that is a DVD about 20 to 30 minutes. And then also this Patriot's Handbook. This goes over what I just went over in this particular presentation. So especially if you're meeting with pastors and other church leaders, let us know. You can always call us at that number on the screen, or go to our website and ask for information, and we'll be back in touch with you. So with that, Dina, let's go ahead and open up some Q&A.
That was absolutely fascinating. And My video seems to be blank, but that's okay as long as you all can hear me. I think that's good enough. So Mario wanted to let you know that their church has been doing Sunday worship protests outside of City
Yeah.
Hall. So they stand outside of City Hall and worship to support their First Amendment rights. Sherry Long wanted to go back to the percentage.
Yes.
And I think you answered this right after she typed it in, but if you want to cover it briefly again, she wrote, does the percentage ever expire?
No, never does. And so, and the best way to do an analysis of this is, again, look at it for an entire year. It's a substantial part of your overall activity. You cannot devote more than a substantial part of your overall activity. So that's with regards to lobbying, and that's your general 5 to 15% rule. So we just looked at the minimum 5%. We know for a fact that is clearly permissible. It never expires. And the best way to do an analysis of that is look at it over a period of year. And here's why you would never even come close to it. Because you've got, say, 52 weeks in a year. And let's just look at Sunday services as opposed to any other services outside of Sunday or weekend services. You've got 52 of those in a year. So you're not going to have on every one of these 52 Sundays, you're not going to have issues that you need to address that involve being in opposition to or in favor of some city, council, county, school board, state, or federal law. Or if you do, you can literally pass out information. You can have a booth out in the lobby that has that information. You can announce it quickly on your screen. The pastor can announce it without giving a whole lot of time to it. But even if you did a lot of time, like from the pulpit, you're not going to be doing that 52 weeks a year. There's just not going to be something that you want to address every week of the year, unless you do it in a smaller, less time-consuming way, like I just described. So that means that you might get closer to the election. Let's just take, for example, 2020 or any other election year where we come into a November election. We're at a point in time where we're getting closer to the election. So now we're wanting to devote more time to these political issues or lobbying issues in this particular case. Let's look at the lobbying issues. For example, bills that may be in Washington, D.C. So you can devote that time, you can crunch that time up, devote a lot of time to it for that shorter period of time. Because outside of those periods of intense activity, if they are intense, you're not going to be devoting as many hours or minutes to it. So it's kind of a rolling one-year cycle that I would look at. And you think about it, when you're looking at your activity, you want to factor in everything that the church does. And I'm talking about everything. All the paid staff, cumulative hours, and all the cumulative hours. I know you don't necessarily track that, but you might have a general idea if you had to address it, of all the volunteerism. Those are the greeters at the door, the Sunday school teachers, the people who are taking up the offering, those that are in the daycare, all of those different activities. If the church has a school, those that are in the school, all the different volunteer and work activities that the church does really is that factor of the 100% of what you do. And that's why when you factor all that in, 5% is an enormous amount of activity that you can devote towards lobbying.
Well, and just to put a real world explanation on this, as you were talking about this, I had this flashback way back when I was in my 20s. I went to Washington, D.C. as part of a delegation to educate Congress about abstinence until marriage. I worked for the National Abstinence Clearinghouse. And I was asked to do an interview and with the Washington Times or Washington Post, I'm not sure which one it was anymore. But she asked me 10 different ways. What are you doing here? What are you guys doing here? What are you doing here? You can only say, we're here to educate so many times. So I used the word lobby. Which one went into the newspaper? We're here to lobby, of course.
Here to lobby,
like,
yeah.
ugh. And so CREW, a group called CREW, the Center for Ethical something or other. There's a W in there. They did a complaint, and the IRS decided to audit us. And now, as you're talking about this, I'm like breathing this giant sigh of relief 10, 15 years later, because I realized we were never anywhere close to coming to that 5%, because this one little trip that we had done was maybe 30 hours, 40 hours of staff time for 3 people out of all of the things we do all year long for abstinence until marriage. So that's phenomenal to know and understand.
And I would also, Dina, on that point, I would always use the word education, because that's really what you're doing.
I did.
Yeah, I know. They kept wanting
Rookie mistake. I'll never make that mistake again.
That's one of the early mistakes. Yeah, but I would always use, like you continued to insist, except for that one time, the word education, because that's really what you're doing. You're educating them.
Youthful inexperience, not knowing how to respond to a question when it was asked for the 10th time.
Yeah. Exactly.
Now I know better. Now I teach how to respond. So can you go over again what constitutes a church according to the law?
Well, I won't go over all the different points. The IRS doesn't have any one specific factor, but the IRS, when you're applying, for example, to be a church, they have a form that you fill out, and it asks you a number of different things. And not any of those are dispositive. They look at them in general collectively. But in general, what you have, and I'll go through a few points, you're meeting together. You have a common set of beliefs. You have a common set of materials, obviously the Bible. You have a regular time to meet. And that's one of the issues that's going through some adjustment with regards to the IRS because of internet-based churches where you're all meeting virtual all the time. And I think, frankly, after what we're seeing with all the online activity in 2020 as a result of COVID, you may ultimately see some movement down the line with regards to the IRS being more lenient and recognizing churches that are only virtual. But typically, you have a common set of doctrine, a common set of information or books that you use, and obviously the Bible is going to be the central one. You could have other ones that you develop later on as well, but the Bible is going to be that particular one. The doctrine of the scriptures that you have, a place where you typically meet, could be a home, could be a storefront, could be some other location where you typically meet, and typically a regular meeting schedule that you have. Could be at any time of the week, but some kind of indicia that you're actually meeting together. Other things that they look at is, do you have any mechanism for membership? Now, different churches have different things on membership, so there's no one size fits all. But do you have any particular criteria for membership? Do they have to believe in certain points? That's not required, but it's just one of the things that they look at. Obviously, do you have any disciplinary procedures as well for removing somebody from membership? Now, some churches are more formal in the people that they consider members, and others are less formal. So there's no one size fits all with regards to that. That's pretty much, the general idea that you would go through. There's other small points that we can flesh out as well. But when you just think about a church meeting together, think about what a church typically does. And then obviously a brand new church is going to be a microcosm of a church that's already up and running and established. And so as you're attending a particular church, you have a location where you go, you have a time that you go, you have a belief set of doctrine that you have, and you have other ways to be able to become a member and to be a part of that body of believers. So essentially, the common sense approach to what you would consider a church to be is what they look at. And so if you are meeting today, say this coming Sunday is your very first time, and you're going to start as a home church, you only have 6 people, for example, you're going to start in your home, and you're going to start as a fellowship. And from that, perhaps grows a church that expands to a storefront or a building, and eventually, something else. From that moment that you began to meet, you will be considered a church. Now, here's the difference between having a letter or not a letter. Your name is not going to be listed in the IRS. In other words, if somebody goes to look you up, the only ones who are going to be on the 501c3 list will be those that the IRS has received an application from and has given a letter to. Your name's not going to be there. Your church name won't be there. But if you ever got challenged, what you do is you present the information of you being a church. You can present some songs, brochures, bulletins, other kinds of things that I've just gone through. But the real practical reason why you would want a letter, again, you don't need one, is for a couple of reasons. One, you want to go down to your local store and you want them to give you the product that you're buying, and you want to tell them that you're tax exempt. And they're going to say, do you have a 501, do you have a letter? Well, if you don't have a letter, you'll just have to educate them on what I just talked about and give them information about you being a church. And that may take a little explaining, but there's a lot of churches right now, and they've been operating for many, many years, that are in that same category. The other might be if you want to apply for a grant from some private foundation. They're going to require you to let them inspect your 501c3 letter. And if you don't have one, they're not going to give you a grant. So it's more of a practical situation, but it's not necessary to have one. Now, if you have a letter, I wouldn't say get rid of it. If you don't have a letter and you're operating okay, then I wouldn't say that you need to get a letter unless you needed it for one of the reasons I just described, a grant, or maybe it's just more convenient for you when you're dealing with your local vendors and your local stores to show them that you're tax exempt. That's the only reason.
Excellent. And Thomas had actually written in exactly that question. And so Thomas, if you can let me know in the chat whether or not that answered your question, because I think it did fairly well. And in the meantime, another, let's see, from Thomas. Oh, no, that was, let's see here. Bev Kilmer, going back to the sex education question. Bev says, we are a nonprofit that is trying to eliminate comprehensive sex ed in the schools. We're preparing a large statewide campaign. Are we in jeopardy?
No, you're a 501c3, I assume. And you, in that, there are things that you would address in that particular situation that might be involving legislation. But a lot of what you're going to be dealing with, as I conceptualize it, has nothing to do with legislation. It's educating people about the sex ed programs that are in these schools and how radical and frankly, in many cases, very deceptive and dangerous they are, particularly those that are backed by groups such as Planned Parenthood. Most people don't have any idea, as you well know, what's coming to these children in these sex education programs. So you will be doing a lot of education that has nothing to do with a particular legislation. However, if you now start to deal with a particular law, state law, that says, one that you support, that says, for example, any sex education has to be abstinent-based, and you're trying to get that particular law passed, that falls into your lobbying category. You're actually going forth as an organization in endorsing and promoting a particular law to get passed in the state regarding abstinence as part of sex education. That would fall into your lobbying. But again, when you're doing that, think of all the other things that you're doing that have nothing to do with a specific piece of local or state legislation, because you're not going to really be dealing too much with federal at this level. But think of specific legislation at the local or state level that you're either opposing this particular bill or this ordinance, or you're supporting this particular bill or this ordinance. Outside of that, it's not going to be lobbying. That's part of your educational mission.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I see about 3 more substantive questions here along the lines, and just to add to Bev is actually, her group is hosting or sponsoring a Leadership Institute training next week on communicating for legislative issues. So the fact that we are educating them, that would be 3 hours for each of her members. That counts towards the overall how much time they put into the event, right? Or their efforts through the year.
Yeah, but if you're just educating on legislative issues, and
it's not a lobbyist. Yeah,
it's not lobbying, and you're not taking a particular position on any particular bill at this point. You're just educating them on what's there, and so that's part of your education. So
yeah.
lobbying is going to be focused on a particular bill or law.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they've got 5 board members who each take the class, that's 15 hours. That goes against that 5% threshold, right?
If in fact what you're doing in that particular time is specifically related to not learning about the law, but actually opposing the law. And that is going to be, these particular board members can do a lot in their own volunteer time. That's not going to be imputed negatively to you.
Yes.
So if they're just learning, being trained on how to approach legislators, all the different legislation that's out there, that's going to be educational, and that wouldn't be lobbying.
Yeah, that's in the positive column, not the negative column, is what I meant.
That's right. Yeah, right.
Okay.
That's right.
Awesome.
That's right.
We had several people ask how to get the product. Jessica has put that into the chat there. You email liberty@lc.org or call them at 407-875-1776. I'm going to do Sherry's and then Pauline's, then Stars. Okay, so Sherry says, we allow our buildings and grounds to be used for county meetings monthly, Constitution classes weekly, and other such items. Do they count towards their non-lobbying time?
Yes. Yeah, that would not be lobbying, and any kind of use that you have would also, like that, be on the other side that you can take the 5% from. So that kind of puts that into the bank of your overall activity, but it's not lobbying.
Excellent. Pauline says, what if the pastor is not so much concerned about the legality, but is afraid of offending some or being branded or attacked by the left? This seems to be the case in many churches. What should she say then?
Yeah, I served on a task force. There was lawyers, nonprofit, and pastors, and I was on the lawyer task force, and we were looking at IRS regulations regarding churches, and the Johnson Amendment was one of those. We ultimately came forth with a proposal to completely do away with the Johnson Amendment or substantially limit it. The chair actually told me that on the pastor's side, I wasn't part of their deliberations, but on the pastor's committee, a pastor that was very prominent, I don't know who he was, actually expressed the idea that he liked the fact that the Johnson Amendment is there, because he could use that as an excuse for why he is not going to address political issues. And I thought that was very sad. And so what I've just presented is there is no reason for pastors or churches to be concerned about either lobbying or political intervention. There's just no reason for it. So once I get done with this, and when I speak to pastors, I say, if you're still not going to address these issues, then don't blame it on the IRS or Uncle Sam or the Johnson Amendment, because that's not true, and you'll know it, and you now know it. It's a bigger issue that you have between you and God, and you are the watchman. John chapter 10, Jesus speaks of himself as the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And he also speaks of people who look like shepherds, but they're more like hirelings. They're getting paid to do the job. And when the wolf comes and tries to ravage the sheep, the good shepherd will lay down his life for the sheep. But the hireling runs away, and the wolf ultimately ravages the flock because that person is just a hireling and not willing to give their life. And what we really need are what Jesus talked about, people that are willing to give their life, lay down their life for their sheep, and that understand that call. And I would say that, you know, there has to be a conversation with pastors or churches that are like that. And there are unfortunately too many that are like that. With the pastor, that it is not an option, it's a duty. It's not an option, it's a duty. The Bible speaks to these issues. We can't ignore them. The people are hungry to hear, how then should we live? Certain things that just happened last week on a national scale. We need to be able to bring the scriptures down to what happens on our everyday life. How is it should we then live? The Bible speaks to all of these issues, and God will hold us, God will hold pastors accountable. James 3 says, don't let many of you become teachers, because you know that teachers are going to be judged by a stricter standard. I used to tell that frequently to our law professors when I was dean of the law school, that it is an awesome responsibility to be a teacher. It's an awesome responsibility to be a pastor, a shepherd, a priest, because we will be held to a higher standard. And God is calling us to ultimately speak to the biblical issues. And the people are frankly needing it. And at the end of the day, whether it's the excuse of the IRS or it's the excuse of some donor in the church that's going to be offended, or perhaps somebody is going to leave the church, what are we going to say to God at that time when we say to the question that God asked, what did you do in your community to stop the shedding of innocent blood of these babies? I'm just using that as one example, but it is a critical example. What did you do? Well, you know, I was afraid that I would lose a donor. We were in a building project. You know, all of those questions, those kinds of answers to that kind of a question will be completely irrelevant. And so that is a bigger spiritual issue, and it's a conversation that needs to be had with any pastor or church leader that is afraid to or refuses to speak out on these particular issues.
That's an awesome answer. And what went through my head is I participated in a confirmation last week, and the young people were told that courage was one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Yes. And courage is doing what's right even when it's hard.
Absolutely.
Your pastors need to have courage. And then Cliff says this. He says, Pastor Staver, as a shepherd, used his staff to guide his flock. He went to law school to get a bigger stick. I like that.
I've never heard that before, but that's interesting.
I love it. Okay. And again, any pastor that says, well, I can't do it because of the law, you can call 407-875-1776 or email liberty@lc.org to get a copy of the Silence is Not an Option pieces of material, DVD and such, to give to your pastor to show him what you've learned today, or her. Okay, the last question.
And also, Dina, we're going to, after the presentation, within 24 hours or so, this will be archived, and so you can go back and direct people to it. We'll put it on our website. I don't know if you have it on your website, Dina, yes, but we'll put it on lc.org. And there's a tab on our website at the top called Churches, and we're going to put it on that page.
Fantastic. And we will also put it up at the leadershipinstitute.org/on-demand classes in the what's called the Campaign Pro section. And I will send everybody instructions on how to get to it, both at LC and at LI. Okay. The last question that actually came in, and there's some very good comments, but most of them, the opportunity to share them had passed. It's just general things. The last question was, is it legal for churches to be closed because of COVID-19? And what can churches whose services have been shut down in person do legally to allow congregating?
Well, that's a good question. The answer to that is no, that it's not legal to close churches. We are litigating around the country. We have cases right now at 4 courts of appeal, and we just filed in California. Recently, we have been working with about a couple thousand pastors around the country. So we're working in all the different states. There's a few states that just have never been an issue, never been a problem. So we've been working in about 44 states. In many states like Florida, because of a case that we had, our first case during this whole COVID, where a pastor was arrested, and we ultimately got involved and got that reversed. Governor DeSantis of Florida on April the 1st removed all restrictions from churches. And churches have been operating in Florida, have been able to operate. Some have voluntarily just chosen not to, but it's not because of the government. Now, in 1947, the Supreme Court in the Everson case said that the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment means at a minimum, and it gave several bullet points. One of the bullet points is this, that neither the state nor the federal government can force someone to attend church against their will, nor prohibit them from attending church against their will. And that's exactly what you see happen. For example, in California, where the governor says you can't sing or chant, that's astounding that a governor thinks he has the authority to micromanage the form and manner of worship. He has no authority. That's why we're litigating there. And now he says you can't have any in-person services, and that includes home Bible studies and fellowship. You can't go to your next door neighbor to have a home Bible study and fellowship. That's just absolutely unconstitutional. You know, if you start in the Old Testament, the king didn't have jurisdiction over the priest didn't have jurisdiction over the king. They were two separate jurisdictions. Jesus said something similar in Matthew 22:21, when he said, "Render to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and to God the things that belong to God." And the church does not belong to Caesar, does not belong to Caesar. There is no constitutional authority. In fact, there's the opposite. There's a prohibition. We have the Free Exercise Clause. We have the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. There is no ability of a governor to place a template on all churches. We have 500,000 or so Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox churches. We're just talking about Christian churches in America. Not even talking about synagogues or other places of worship, such as mosque or whatever. Just churches. About 500,000, 500,000. They have different sizes, different doctrine, different kinds of worship, different demographics. You can't put a one-size-fits-all on them and tell them how to worship, or whether they can only have 10 people when their sanctuary seats 1,000, or whatever it may be. These draconian restrictions are unconstitutional. Now, courts have split right now both ways. We're working to get one case finally back to the U.S. Supreme Court. Don't believe what you read in the media that the Supreme Court has decided this issue. It has not. It has not. We actually address that on our website at lc.org. Those were emergency motions. There's no final decision. We have the two cases right now. We actually have 4 cases, but we have 2 3-0 wins at the Court of Appeals in Kentucky, where they banned all worship. And we ultimately won, first of all, parking lot services, and then secondly, in-person services. So all the restrictions have been removed. So the short answer is no, they can't. How are they getting away with it? Because they're not being challenged, and some of the courts have gone the wrong way, but there's a number of courts that have gone the right way. And it's just a matter of time before this nonsense stops across the country. You can't just simply say, and by the way, talk about why it's important to vote. Every one of the states in which we are litigating right now, and others that we're not litigating, with the most severe restrictions on churches, there's a common denominator. The common denominator is the governor of that state is radically pro-abortion. If they don't respect your life, they're not going to respect your freedom either. That's why it's important to vote. Voting matters, and voting is very critical. And so that really comes around full circle to why we are doing this seminar today.
Phenomenal. What a way to end. Thank you so very much. Let me do a quick search here. I don't see any other questions there, so I'm going to pause the screen share for a moment and share my own screen. Let's see here. Let me make that large and share. So you should see the lc.org website right now. So this is where you're going to go to get the information and the playback. Here's silence is not an option today. And I'm sure the replay will be posted there as soon as I send them the copy of it, and I will get that to them as soon as the recording is rendered and able to go. And then so that's lc.org. And then the Leadership Institute, if you go on to Get Trained, right up here, it says On Demand Classes. That's where you're going to go to watch the replay on our site. So either one will work. We just want you to have access to this information, and it is fantastic. If you've got any questions, they take, if you've got a problem with your church, you've got a problem with your governor trying to shut down your services, just reach out. lc.org is where to go. Just an example of how it works, what it works. One of my best friend's husbands is in the Navy, and he was given a piece of paper and told that he had to sign it. And among other things, it said that he would not go to any off-base religious services. Well, his base did not have religious services. And so they sent it to me. I sent it to LC. I don't even know that you guys ever got to touch it because there was such an uproar that within a few days, this got overturned so that our Navy personnel could attend religious services. But I know that the person with whom I spoke at your organization was definitely interested in taking this forward and making sure that our families in the Navy could attend religious services, because how ridiculous is it to stifle our fighting men and women's First Amendment right. So anyway, thank you guys so very much for all that you do. Congratulations on the victories that you've had in the courts. I just pray that you all continue to stay strong and continue to fight and continue to have victories. Is there anything else that we as lay people can help you in your ministry?
No, I think just continue to pray for Liberty Counsel and obviously Leadership Institute. And you can always visit lc.org, where you have tabs on the top where you can sign up for our emails and other communication vehicles there as well. And pray for us, because we're in a lot of these church cases, plus many other pro-life cases and many other cases. But obviously the church issues are very significant right now. We're doing that all over the country.
Fantastic. Cliff just said this was encouraging, and Sherry is saying thank you and amen. And so I thank you very much. Now, next week, Mr. Staver, would you like to give us a preview? On Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m., we're going to be talking about the Title VII. And so we're going to do this again next week. So tell us a little bit about that one here.
Yeah, what we're going to do next week is we're going to be talking about Title VII, which is the employment provision of the federal law. And the U.S. Supreme Court in the Bostic case just recently issued a decision, a terrible decision, frankly. We're going to unpack that, but we're also going to look at how do you address it and what impact does it have with regards to churches as well as other nonprofit and religious organizations, for-profit organizations. So any church, nonprofit organization, or for-profit organization, any employer really is what we're going to be talking about, that is operating under religious principles will benefit from this, because we'll talk about the case, its application, its limits, and then how you can ultimately protect your place of ministry or business in light of what the Supreme Court did.
Fantastic. And you all can register for that at leadershipinstitute.org/LC, or frankly, little secret here, the exact same website that took you into today's classroom will take you into next week's. So leadershipinstitute.org/grassroots webinar. You don't even have to sign up again. I'll take care of that on the back end. So thank you so very much, Mr. Staver. This was vitally important information. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I don't, Dina. Thank you for allowing me to participate, and thank you for all the people that participated.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us. In the meantime, you guys have a great day. We will see you again next week, and I will be getting all of the stuff that we've talked about in this webinar today out to you in an email. So thank you guys. You have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.